So today we have a exciting guest lecturer. Cordero is someone that I had the privilege to do my PhD with. I think you were a couple years ahead of me, so you had a little bit more, kind of like my senior, but I think have definitely had a unique background. And I'll let you kind of talk about it, but someone who has a lot of experience, both in the collegiate setting as well as the professional sports setting. Cordero, this class is really an introduction to data and sports science. So a lot of the students here are coming from very different backgrounds, from exercise science and movement science, but all the way to engineering to to business. And so we have a quite a unique, diverse group here. Um, I'll talk to you before this, but our class is really structured in a sense. We're just giving them an introduction to sports science and data, sort of analytics in a sense, how to take different wearable technologies and kind of think about it from a data analysis perspective. Um, anything from like, did someone's sprint times get better? Stuff like that. Using like catapult devices and whatnot. So just a general introduction is the focus of this class, but I know the students here will benefit greatly from your expertise and your presentation. So I'll let you take it from here, man. I did want to ask if you're okay with me recording this just for this class. If not, I can always turn it off, but just let me know and we'll get started.
Oh yeah, I'm perfectly okay with you recording this. I actually prefer if you record this. Um,
Perfect.
that's the first thing. That's the first thing said when I told him I was doing this guest lecture.
Yeah.
So
Oh, I got you. Yeah. Don't. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and then I'll let you, um, pop your screen up and take it from there.
sounds good.
Wait, so let me just make you a co-host. All right, man. You should have.
Okay. Share screen. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Just fine.
Yep, I can see it. Anybody
Everybody's
from the
good?
class want to
Cool.
give me a? Yeah. Yep.
All right, awesome. So, again, I appreciate Dr. Singh allowing me to come through and give you guys a quick little guest lecture. Again, my name is Dr. Cordero Roche. Me and Dr. Singh, we know each other as he spoke on previously. We did our PhD together here at UNLV, and he's been doing great things in his short career. I've been doing great things in my short career. Quick background about me. I did my undergrad and master's at Troy University. While I was at Troy University, I did play football there for a little bit. And also, while I was at Troy University for my master's, I was also a strength and conditioning coach there, working under my former strength and conditioning coach, who was my strength coach when I played football there. But I did my PhD here at UNLV. Again, that's how me and Dr. Singh first encountered each other. And what led me to get my PhD is because while I was a strength and conditioning coach, that was the path I believed I was initially going to go down for my career. I just saw the trajectory or the shift in the industry, how everything was moving more towards technology. And at the time, I didn't have nearly as much experience with that. So I understood in order for me to stay up to date in the field, if I wanted to grow in the direction of the field that I had to grow, I had to learn the technology side of things. And upon me graduating my PhD, I was a strength and conditioning coach for the United States Army. And then I got my first break in professional sports. I was a sports scientist in Major League Baseball for the past couple of seasons, specifically working with the Tampa Bay Rays and the New York Mets. And then upon completion of that season with the New York Mets, I did a little sports science consulting work with the G League team. And now I landed my role here at UNLV. I'm currently the Speed Lab coordinator here for UNLV for Sports Innovation Institute. And the purpose of that is to provide educational outreach to the K through 12 schools in the Las Vegas Valley area, and also to provide our expertise with our sports science analysis and research properties for the local sports teams in town as well. So you guys are actually in like a great position because you guys actually have a class like this to help prepare you how to integrate the data and the technology with human performance with your practice. So this is great that you guys were able to learn from an individual as accomplished as Dr. Singh, and hopefully from my presentation, this can only add on to what you guys are learning, and you guys can find something useful for this to add to your practice as you grow in your career. So that brings me to my sample talk I want to talk to you guys about. And we'll be talking about, well, I'll briefly go over ranking thresholds and statistical models and how you can apply these in your practice and what they actually mean and how they should actually be interpreted. So you see in practice, when you're working with data, you can easily fall subjective to information overload. So as you know, with the data that you can collect data on anything. And with the data that's collected, remember, the main reason why we collect the data, it helps us quantify what is happening and why that is happening. And we also understand that with the amount of data that you do collect over time, it can be overwhelming. So that's why it's very important in your practice that you focus on the metrics and the data that's most important. So now you're asking yourself exactly how do I determine what data is most important for my practice? Well, here's how we decide useful information. As you see, this graphic here just illustrates how exactly you will go about funneling out what data is most important for you. So first you go through that process of funneling out the information most important. And you also got to understand as you're funneling out the information that's most important to you, it's always good to have communications with the others in your department because some metrics are going to be more important, or some professionals may deem these metrics more beneficial for their practice compared to others. So that's where the open conversations have to happen in order for you guys to have a clear understanding as to what metrics will be most useful in the practice that you guys are trying to establish. So make sure that you, just looking at the graphic, you collect the raw footage, you do the observations, and then if there's any additional information, that's when you go in and collect that. And then from the information that you gather, that's when you analyze the data. That's when you guys come to an understanding, and you have to work through that whole entire process before you then implement it on the players. Because you want to make sure whatever practice you implement on your athletes or your players, you want to make sure that it's foolproof, that you're not wasting their time or your time, and that everybody is safe and the operation is practical that you're implementing. So next, how exactly do we use the information? So the information that's gathered is stored in the database, and you got to have a place where you store all that information. And that's typically in what's called an AMS, which is an acronym for an athlete management system. The most well-known athlete management system out there is called SmarterBase. That's typically what a lot of teams use. And that's where you will store just about any metric that you're collecting, whether it's from force plate data, motion capture data, GPS data, whatever it is. That'll be your database, which is like your one-stop shop. If you ever need to recall a metric, whatever that metric of interest is to you, you will store it right in that athlete management system. And it should be readily accessible to all of those in the operation who you wish to have access to. And also with the information, you can use it to visualize the data to better tell the story. I mean, yeah, it does speak volumes when you have these numbers, but at the same time, if you visualize it for those who you're trying to communicate it with, specifically working in sports, because typically athletes learn better more from visual cues than better from audio cues. So you can actually put this out there in a visualization that helps them better understand it. I'm pretty sure the information will be better relayed across your operation, and you'll also have more efficient results on interpreting the information to your cohorts. So we go from visualizing the data to creating leaderboards. Understand how you can take the data and have it tell a story visually too. So leaderboards are great whenever you're trying to create that internal competition. Whenever you're going for testing, athletes, a lot of times, they already have a lot of pressure that's built up on them due to the performance metrics the performance needs that needs to be met throughout the season or whatever it may be. So when these guys get together, it's a form of camaraderie for them. So you can create that little external edge. If you can make training fun for them, if you can make them actually want to be there and enjoy the fact while they're there, go ahead and create a leaderboard and add a little extra competition factor to it. And it just creates higher buy-in for your athletes across the board. And it's also important to update the leaderboards because it could improve the athlete's confidence. Athletes always want to know where they stand at. I mean, they're doing all this training, and to sum it up, they're not doing this training for second place. So if the athletes can actually see how they're improving, if they can have their metrics updated periodically, that'll do wonders for their confidence, especially when they can assess their performance, how they are when they start at the beginning of the season to the midpoint of the season, and how well they're performing at the end. It speaks volumes, not just for the athletes to see, but it also speaks volumes for the health professionals and the organizations to see also, because they can better understand exactly how the athlete is improving or in some cases regressing. And by this data that's collected, it can help drive the direction of the training program. And again, this helps communication of the data between the athletes and the performance professionals when creating these leaderboards. So you go from creating leaderboards to now we're creating thresholds. So you know what leaderboards are. You can rank them from highest to lowest, best to worst, however you wish to categorize them. But thresholds, that right there can tell another story. So thresholds ideally should be created from the data that's collected in-house. So every organization across the league, depending on what sport you're working in, they're going to have different thresholds. They're all going to have different metrics because everybody's going to be different. The threshold is going to be different based off the athletes you have in-house. The threshold is going to be different based off what specific metrics that you value over the others, and so on and so on. So it's important when creating these thresholds that you do have the data that's collected in-house. Now, there are some that are created league-wide, but it's not typical you will have someone else's internal data in another operation. So that's why it's best to have a database already established within your own organization. And remember, thresholds should help drive the direction of the training program. And it's also important to note that thresholds should not be the end-all be-all. In other words, you should learn your athlete's capabilities. And the last point at the bottom is that you should not get too wrapped up in the numbers. So even though you do see a threshold here, for example, if you look at the graphic, this is from max velocity values that was collected with the GPS back from my time when I was working with the Mets. So throughout the organization, you can see that there was a threshold of 18, and the 18 stands for 18 miles per hour. So that was just a threshold, which is like the average, what was saw across the organization. But if you notice somebody came in and they were first assessed and they hit a maximum miles per hour of 12 miles per hour. And then you notice throughout the season, the beginning they started at 12 miles per hour, but throughout the season they improved to 16 miles per hour. Me personally, as a professional, I wouldn't get too wrapped up in the fact that they did not meet the threshold. Instead, I would celebrate the fact on the noticeable improvement on how the athlete started at 12 miles per hour and improved to 16 miles per hour. Reason being, that shows positive signs of the training program and how the athletes responded throughout the season. So to me, that's a positive nugget, and to where I wouldn't necessarily get too wrapped up in them trying to get a higher number. I would just celebrate the fact that there was some type of improvement. And that's how I would assess every single athlete individually across the board. So that's important of the fact of not to get too wrapped up in the numbers. Yeah, it's great to see somebody achieve the highest max in the organization, whatever that may be, depending on the metric that you're collecting. But overall, don't forget the story you're trying to tell, and don't forget the practice you're trying to implement and why this metric was collected in the first place and what that actually means to each athlete individually. So now interpreting these thresholds. Remember, you use the thresholds to help tell a story. And one of the main purposes of a threshold, they can help determine or understand the athlete's usage. So high or low values doesn't necessarily always mean good, and they don't necessarily always mean bad. Again, it's all about the story you're trying to tell and exactly what you need this data and these metrics that you collected. It's all about what you're trying to get them to convey. And the thresholds also help with creating the training plan. But remember, all the data that we collect, however we interpret it, the data that we collect in journal helps creates and helps drives the training plan or philosophy that we have in place for the athlete, that we have in place for the team for that day. All the data that we use is just used to quantify player readiness or player performance, however way we see fit to quantify and measure that. So interpreting thresholds as we continue, it's important to understand the difference between absolute and relative values. And you need to know when they apply, and you also need to understand that the context matters. So I want you guys to pay attention to this graph. So for example, I want you to specifically look at the player Lester Quinones. So if you look at this graph, and if you scroll over to your right, you'll see minutes per game, how much he's averaging. And you see in this graph, he's in the red threshold. So to give a breakdown, if you're in the red on this graph, that threshold means that you have an extremely high usage rate as it relates to minutes. If you're in the orange, you're semi-high, yellow, moderate, light blue, low. So in this one, Lester Quinones, he's in the red to show that he has a high minutes per game usage rate. Now, as I refer back to the previous graph, pay attention to Lester Quinones' name. Now he's all the way down in the blue to show that he doesn't have an overall total minutes high enough to qualify him in the red threshold. So see, this is where knowing the difference between relative and absolute comes into play. Because if I was just looking at the absolute, which is this is what this is, just the total amount of minutes collected throughout the season, it would show that Leicester does not have a high usage rate. But yet, if I was to go look at the relative, it shows that he does have a high usage rate. As a matter of fact, the second highest on the team. And now that's when we go to break this down and to quantify it even more. What does this mean? He has a high usage rate in minutes per game, but a low overall minutes total collected. Then we look over to the total games. Well, it showed that he got there or probably got hurt at the beginning of the season, or probably got to the team towards the end of the season because it showed he's only accounted for 6 games total. So that's important where context matters as far as knowing the difference between absolute and also knowing the difference between relative data. Because this helps paint a picture, paints the picture that you're trying to relate to your athletes and to your stakeholders so they can better understand player usage rates. And now statistical model. So it's important that you find the right statistical test to tell the story that you are trying to convey. So each statistical model is going to give you a different outcome of a story. If you're trying to do a regression, it's going to show you the relationships, how these metrics relate to each other. If you're going to do a correlation plot, which that's what this graph is showing here. This is a correlation plot. So to explain a correlation plot, it basically explains the coincidence, not exactly the relationship. So for example, if I show that I gained 50 pounds in my bench press max, but I also gained 20 pounds during that same time, well, I can probably see a strong relationship between my weight gain in pounds and also my improvement in bench pressing 50 extra pounds from when I first started. A coincidence would be every time I walk into a casino backwards, I always win $1,000. Just for whatever reason may be, there's nothing that explains why that happens, but just coincidentally, every time I walk into a casino backwards, for whatever reason may be, I always win $1,000. That's just a coincidence. There's nothing that explains why that happens. There's nothing related to that outcome. It's just a coincidence. It just happens to be that way. So that's what's displayed here in this chart is a correlation graph. And this correlation graph is from the metrics that I took from the previous athletes that you saw in the graphic that I just displayed to you all when we were talking about interpreting thresholds. So this is just their total game metrics from minutes, distance covered, match speed, and also total games played. And it's just a correlation matrix that was ran between each metric. Now, with this, if I was presenting this to a stakeholder to basically help them understand any square that is completely solid blue or completely solid red, those would be the metrics that I personally would take to heart because that shows the strongest correlation. Any metric that is slightly blue or slightly red, those metrics do not have a strong correlation. So that means that typically there's nothing showing that there is a coincidence that something is the cause for the other. But statistical models, that just goes to show you an important example of why each statistical model, why selecting one is important, because you're trying to tell the story of what the data means and the outcome and how that should be applied to your training program. So again, with the statistical model, it effectively explains what these results mean. And the results from the test are used to be suggestions and recommendations. They're not used to be determinations. In other words, let's say you do find a significant difference for whatever metric that it is that you're measuring, and you ran another statistical test. That's not a good idea to, in reference, let's say baseball. At that time, it's not a good idea to go up to the baseball manager and say, you need to do this because I found this statistical difference. That's not a conversation. That's not a way how I would approach that conversation. Instead, talks would start with the rest of the performance staff as to exactly what was found, as to exactly what this means, and how we should implement this in the program going forward. And then they would slowly work their way up to the top and conversations with the athletes about how these results can help shape the future direction of your training program. And also, it's important to adjust with the game as it changes over time. The game's always changing. The way football is played in the NFL now in 2025 is completely different from the way the game was played back in 2010. And the way the game was played in 2010 is completely different from the way it was played in 1995, and so on and so on. The game is always changing. The athletes that the scouts are looking for, they're always evolving, they're always changing. So, with that being said, it's always important to adjust your practice with the game as that changes as well. So here's a few things to remember. You should always evaluate your athletes regularly. Now, what that looks like, that's up for you to determine what that looks like in your practice. And you're going to determine that based on time constraints, based on competence of the equipment and testing procedures, based off what's available in-house and et cetera and et cetera. Also, do not focus on athletes achieving certain numbers or percentiles. Now, I'm not saying it's not okay to set goals. We always recommend you set goals. You should always set goals. But just remember, we care more about how well the athlete is performing in their sport. So I could care less if Patrick Mahomes can bench 400 pounds. Can he still effectively throw a 60-yard bomb on a dime and hit my receiver in stride? That's all I care about. I could care less if Shohei Hatane can squat over 800 pounds. Can he still hit me 40 home runs, and can he still go out there and pitch an and pitch a season with the ERA under 3? Like, we have to make sure that our training programs, that our practices are strictly tailored towards how it's going to make that athlete be better at their sport. I know we all have this idea that the typical athlete looks like what we envision Michelangelo would carve out of stone, but sometimes your typical athlete or your great athletes is just going to be somebody with what people refer to as a dad bod, what you would say. but they're extremely good at their sport. They have this talent that's just God-given and generational. And we have to make sure that they maintain that talent as long as they can, as long as the good Lord gives them the ability to perform. And it's also important to stay up to date with the current research. There's always new research that's being developed. Again, as I said in the slide earlier, the game's always changing. So the game's always changing is always going to pose new questions. Trust me, until the end of time, there will always be plenty of questions to ask. And based off the demand of the questions, it's going to be tailored towards the future or how that sport is currently played now. There's a lot of these results that were collected and related to the sport that we know now. Some of it's related to the sport on how they look at it on when they collected it back in the 90s. Well, maybe we should reassess some of that stuff and retest some of those metrics that we do from the 90s up into current times and see if there's a difference. And that just goes on to my next point to don't be afraid to retest previous research because of what I just said. There's going to be new athletes, there's going to be new rules, there's going to be new demands of the sports and et cetera, et cetera. And all of that could potentially impact the changes of the outcome. And by those changes of the outcome that we derive from, that could also impact the way we go about doing our practice and our research. So stay up to date with the current research and also don't be afraid to retest previous research. And at the same time, related back to everything I just said, but at the same time, if you have an effective practice in place, don't replace it. If it's not fit, if it's not broken, don't fix it. So, with that being said, I thank you everyone for taking your time out to listen to me. Hopefully you got something from this presentation. And I will leave it open for any questions or comments if any of you all have any. Thank you.
Cordero, thank you so much. That was excellent. I think you hit on some really really good things because actually today's lecture is going to be on statistical modeling, so it kind of is a really good transition into what you've kind of talked about. And I think from the practical side of things, also sometimes these classes are great in order to kind of explain what what we do on the daily, but the practical nature of the jobs are um, they're different in a sense where it's not like you just said in the recent slide of not fixing what was that don't fix what
What
is
ain't
not
broken?
broken, yeah,
Yeah.
whatever, yeah, like that's a perfect example of sometimes there's just systems that are working, and
Mhm.
they may not be like the most advanced, but they get the job done, and I think that's like super important. Um, to your point, I'll leave it up. Anyone have any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, or put it in the chat. Otherwise, I definitely have one question that I think we will all benefit from. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to. I'll give it a few seconds. If you want to put in the chat, raise your hand, unmute yourself.
Somebody got to have at least one.
Yeah, you gotta give me one. This just means you did a really good job, by the way. um, I'll start with one. So one of the things you had mentioned is like obviously thresholds being a huge part of what you do, and kind of what you did with baseball. Um, my question is, determining those thresholds, is that more of like a statistical modeling thing that's done sort of on the back end, or like obviously probably more research driven? So like, how do you kind of determine some of those thresholds? If you want to speak to a little bit about that, that'd be great.
I
Especially with
guess.
like, sorry, I should probably preface this without, especially with like wearable tech. I should probably preface that, with that, with wearable tech. How do you kind of go about, looking at thresholds and determining them, and do they kind of change over time? If you want to share anything on that.
Yes, 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 yes. To answer the
Yeah,
question.
perfect.
Um, those thresholds that I showed you with that metric when I was out during my time with the Mets. So part of it was literature based, but also part of it came from, also part of it was discussed internally with the organization too, because they also had like a idea where they, or at least a threshold for them where they ideally would like to see their athletes be at. So it wasn't necessarily a mean number that set that threshold. It came more so from an ideal target where the organization wanted to see their athletes reach for them to say, okay, this is ideal threshold where they deem suitable. So, um, now with that, yeah, it does change over time. Um, and how that looks like it changed over time, that again comes from organizations and conversations with those inside. You know, um, that metric was collected with the GPS data and the GPS data that was collected from that. I'm sure you're familiar with Catapult. That's like the gold standard. That time when I was with the Mets, we used a system called Stat Sports. I'm not sure you're familiar with that one, but that's where those metrics came from with Stat Sports. It was obviously stored in our AMS, our athlete management system. And the thresholds do change over time, you know, and how that looks, like I said, that just comes from conversations that's continued on throughout the organization. And that also looks based off the athletes that are in-house. Like depending on the type of athletes that are brought in, you may have heavier athletes, or however you want to categorize them, or they may not be as fast as the athletes that you recruited in the past. So you may look and say 18 may not be ideal. You may drop it to 16, or maybe you may look and say that you want to build a team that's that's known for stealing bases. So you're gonna bring in more guys who have speed. So that may raise the threshold to 19 because of the type of team that you're trying to create. Because the practice that you're creating is using the data to quantify the performance, and that's relating it to the athletes. And you can only work with the athletes, as you know, Dr. Singh, you can only work with the athletes that the front office gives you. So you have to quantify the
Yeah.
performance for the athletes that you have, and you have to make it look good so you can present that data to the front office. Not to the standpoint, as you know, Dr. Singh, of just putting something out to
Yeah.
say, yeah, this looks cute, but to the standpoint of from your practice, the metrics that you're collecting, how to present this in a way that's easy for them to follow along. And that can also show them that, our performance is ideal to their standards.
Yeah, perfect. This also like kind of goes hand in hand with that. We're gonna have a visualization lecture in a couple weeks, and we'll talk a lot about what stakeholders you're presenting to, right? Like graphs for different types of people, and um, oh, that's spot on, man. I appreciate you taking the time to answer that question. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to put in the chat. And if anything, Cordero, I can share with questions that we have, later on in the class. If people come up with them, share them with you off air and kind of, see what you have to say. And I can always tell the class, your answers. So, um, but man, all that being said, I appreciate your time. And yeah, thank you for coming on and sharing your knowledge with us.
This was awesome, man. I really appreciate the opportunity. I had fun doing this. Even though nobody
Yeah,
asked me a question live, it's all right. I'm assuming I'm gonna have more coming after this. It's fine. But
yeah, you will.
whatever questions
Yeah,
they may have, just send them my way, Dr. Singh. I'll be more than happy to answer them and get back to them as soon as I can. But appreciate the opportunity today.
sweet. Oh, absolutely, man. And I'll definitely share the recording with you later on, and so you can. I know Dr. Mercer will probably want to hear it or ask you for it. So, but yeah, man. Thanks again. Appreciate it. And for the rest of the class, we do have a short little lecture, so please stay on, and we'll get that going right away.
All right, sounds
Sweet.
good.
Appreciate it, man. All right, let me see if I can do this. Let me.